Hello everyone, I am Charlie Tolhurst and welcome to the Hotlap Vodcast here, live across socials, and yes, live everyone. Hello, I'm Charlie. This is a motorsport podcast that I am going to be presenting every week. And yes, episode 3 is here of the Hotlap Vodcast, and for the first time ever, I am going to be broadcasting all across social media. I am live on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, all across those 3 platforms. Please, guys, get in the comments. If you want to ask me a question on this podcast, please do. There is a comment section on there if you would like to comment on the stream. I have loads of great things that I'm going to be talking about today. And this episode is going to be specifically talking about Jim Clark, who is one of Formula One's most successful drivers. So please, everyone, if you've got a comment, please let me know, and you can ask me that question directly. So, yes, let's get on with the podcast. Now, as you all guys would have known, Jim Clark is a Formula One racing driver. He was a former F1 driver. And Jim Clark, of course, raced in Formula One during the 1960s. He was known as the quiet champion. He won 2 F1 World Championships. And he also spent most of his career racing with Lotus. In fact, all of his career was actually spent racing with Lotus. Did you not know that, guys, actually? It was a very interesting fact about Jim Clark as well. He was actually born in Scotland in 1936, and he entered Formula One in the 1960s. His first entry was actually in 1960. It was actually the Dutch Grand Prix. So his first entry actually came at Zandvoort in 1960. But Clark wasn't just a driver who raced in Formula One. No, he was successful in multiple motor racing series, which I'll come on to a bit later on, and I'll explain to you listeners exactly what some of the motorsport series that he was successful in was. So Clark grew up in Scotland in the 1930s. And of course, he was a person who loved cars from a young age. He moved to Berkshire in 1942. He was educated in Scotland. He studied in Scotland at school. He then moved to another university as well. And of course, Clark had in 1960, he was featured in the first race at Goodwood. But in 1960, he actually made his debut in the 1960. Lotus had lost John Surtees, who went to the Isle of Man TT. And of course, Clark took over from Surtees at Lotus, and he would go on to become one of Formula One's most successful drivers. So 1960 was his first season in the sport. His second race was held at the extremely fast and dangerous Spa-Francorchamps there, when he got a taste of 2 fatal accidents which occurred by Chris Bristow and Alan Stacey. And in a 1964 interview, he said, "I was driving stiff pretty much all throughout the race," even though he finished 5th and scored his first points finish there in Spa. So it was a very interesting race for Clark that year. But of course, Clark was a driver who always never used to give up. And whatever racing car you gave Jim Clark, he would drive it to the absolute limit. I'm talking the absolute limit. Jim Clark would drive there as if he was the driver who become known very much as a world champion. And he drove it like a champion. He was a true racing driver to everyone in the sport. And I know that because Jim Clark was a driver who brought up the sheer speed and the sheer legacy of a racing driver. He was the man who brought up the racing drivers' names. It was all very much a true legend in the sport. And we all know that because Jim Clark himself was a driver that fought so hard for his moral rights. And of course, it was very much an interesting experience getting to see Jim Clark race in motor racing. So, yes. So I'm now going to share my screen quickly because I'm actually going to show you some of Jim Clark's most famous races right now. And if you can just see, I'm on there right now. I'm onto a page that I've just found. But Jim Clark, in terms of his history, well, let's have a look at his F1 success, shall we? And his F1 success is massive. So here is a little extract from a Formula One article that I've just found. This was him here in 1962 signing autographs for Team Lotus as well. A photograph here of in 1963, him taking pole position at Monaco in a retired Lotus 25. He was classified 8th, which was his lowest placing of the year in 1963. Clark came from 8th on the grid to win the 1963 Belgian Grand Prix. In 1964, he was checking the mirrors of his Lotus 25 before racing at Brands Hatch. And I believe he won that race at Brands Hatch in 64 as well. And in 1965 Nürburgring, he celebrated one of the German Grand Prix as well. So these were some of the highlights of Jim Clark as well. Reigning champion in 1966, he was defending his title. 2 world championships Jim Clark won as well. 1963, he won the first world championship with Lotus in the 25. And actually, Clark won that year 7 out of 10 races that season. It was Clark won 7 out of 10 races in his career as well, which was at the time more successful than any driver in the world. And it shows you just how brilliant he was. Clark won 7 out of 10 races in a season where there was only 3 races where he didn't win. I mean, it's huge. Clark was very fast back in the 60s. And Formula One back then were running cars with manual gearboxes. The Lotus 25, of course, was the first F1 car to use a carbon fibre monocoque chassis. It was a monocoque chassis that they used. It wasn't carbon fibre, but it was actually monocoque chassis, which was sort of constructed off a carbon fibre tub. So, yeah, it was very interesting. And obviously, Clark's success in F1 that year was huge. But the year that Clark had the most success in was 1965. And this was where we get to some of the best bits from Jim Clark's career. So in 1965, Clark entered multiple motor racing events that year. And it was known as his epic 1965 seasons, according to Peter Windsor. And it was a fantastic year for Clark. Clark competed in, of course, the Tasman series as well. If you remember, the Tasman series is a racing series that he competed in. And he was very, very fast, wasn't he? I mean, looking at the success of Jim Clark, the Tasman series, 1965, he actually won the Tasman series in 1965 as well, which was an astonishing achievement that he won the 1965 Tasman series. In Formula One as well, he also wrapped up his the world championship in 65 as well. He won 6 races that season, and in 63 he won 7 out of 10 races in 1963. 1965 he won. There were only 8. In 1965 there were 9 races, and he won 6 of them. So it was a 70% win record for Jim Clark in 63. But just looking at that, it was a fantastic. His best result at Le Mans was 3rd, which was in an Aston Martin DB1. He raced with, in 1960, Border Rivieras, which were used in the DBR 1300. It was with Roy Salvadori. In 1961, he raced with Ron Flockhart. And in 1959, he raced with Sir John Henry Douglas Whitmore, or John Whitmore as he was known as in short there. So just looking at some of the results from Clark there, very, very successful achievements as well. Belgium, and obviously Spa as well. The Belgium Grand Prix, one of Clark's favourite races of the year. If you remember Jim Clark, he was a driver who loved Spa. He was a driver that won the race by over 3 minutes. I mean, it was a fantastic achievement for Clark. I mean, look, he won that race in dramatic style. It was an impressive achievement in pouring rain conditions. Jim Clark won the Belgian Grand Prix in wet conditions. If you just see the photos there of the 1963 Belgian Grand Prix, this was what Jim Clark actually said. Mind the gap, and in massive 4 minutes 54 seconds separated the first and second in the 1963 Belgian Grand Prix won by Jim Clark. He won the race by nearly 5 minutes that day. It was incredible. And that was one of Clark's greatest drives for me. He was a driver who pushed that to the limit. Then, of course, Clark entered the Indianapolis 500, which, if you don't know, the Indianapolis 500, guys, is an event that occurs every year on the IndyCar season, and it's one of the most prestigious events in motorsport, forms part of the Triple Crown. For anybody who's watching this, if you don't know what the Triple Crown is, the Triple Crown is essentially where you have to win the Formula One World Championship, the Monaco Grand Prix, the Indianapolis 500, and of course you also have to win Le Mans as well. Graham Hill is the only driver to ever achieve that particular feat. But yes, Jim Clark actually took part in a couple of Indianapolis 500s. In 1964, he actually made his debut in the Indianapolis 500, raced for Lotus, and he actually finished second on his debut. He should have won that one, though, because the leader, I believe, was meant to be disqualified. Clark actually finished second against seasoned veterans in his first ever start in that event in 1964. When he started racing in Indy, you're like, Indianapolis, you're going to be one of the toughest events in the world. And it was such a difficult race for him. But it was huge. Then in 1965, in a Lotus, which is pictured here, a top speed of 160 miles per hour, average speed in a Lotus 38, Jim Clark won the event in 1965 against seasoned veterans, and Clark stormed to race victory. If you don't know this, guys, Clark was a dominant force in the 1965 Indianapolis 500, the event which, for many people, summed up his 1965 season. If you know what I mean, yes, Clark dominated this event, and it was huge. And right now, I'm going to play this special video of Jim Clark winning his first ever Indianapolis 500. Have a listen to this right now.
It's May the 31st.
Sorry there, guys. We just have some technical difficulties, but we're going to play for the video right now. This is Jim Clark winning the first Indianapolis 500.
It's May the 31st, 1965. The Indianapolis 500 is about to get underway. Among the drivers in this 500-mile, 200-lap event is the brilliant young Scotsman, Jim Clark. Shortly after the start, the 1963 Formula One World Champion shows his class by storming ahead in his Lotus 4. And by halfway, he's 2 minutes clear of the competition.
Jim Clark flashes by. He's in the lead. Clark still leads. He's unbeatable, barring a breakdown. And Clark's the winner. What a victory for this 29-year-old Scot. First Briton ever to win the Indianapolis 500. The race that Americans looked on as their exclusive property. His average speed an incredible 150.68 miles an hour. And that raised the record by more than 3 miles per hour.
The Scots' triumph nets him a record prize fund of $150,000. But even more importantly, Jim Clark has just become the first Briton to win America's most prestigious motor race.
Thank you there. And that video summed up Jim Clark winning that 1965 Indianapolis 500, the first ever Briton to win the event. Wow, what an achievement. And he was also the first non-championship driver to win the event as well. I mean, I can't think of any other drivers. I mean, Fernando Alonso could have accomplished that in 2017. And of course, his Honda engine let go with not that many laps to go. It was in the closing stages. And yeah, Clark, that year in 1965, unbeatable was the word you need. And just, oh my God, wow. A dominant victory for the Scot, who led that race 3 times, a total of 190 laps. It was incredible. And it was huge just to see exactly how the race was recapping. And Clark, yeah, was fastest in qualifying, in the box score, and then in the race. He absolutely smashed the rest of the field. He dominated that event. I think he won by something over 5 minutes, if I'm correct, as well. He dominated that around as well. It was huge. It was absolutely huge. I could not stress how massive this win was for everyone who was just honestly just watching this. It was huge. And yeah, it was a huge event. And of course, for many people, it was a huge event. And Jim Clark was a racing driver who thrashed seasoned veterans. Of course, these drivers who were competing in IndyCar in 1965 were all seasoned veterans. And when you have a look at who was racing that year in 1965, you just have to go back to some of the drivers. You got Parnelli Jones. He was even racing, of course, Mario Andretti as well, who is a multiple Indianapolis 500 winner. Of course, he raced as well in Le Mans, a career that spanned 3 decades in motorsport. And he was the only racing driver to win on major race on road course, paved ovals and dirt tracks, was Mario Andretti. And yes, Jim Clark actually beat Mario Andretti that year, who of course was actually going to enter Formula One himself, was Mario Andretti. And if you think about it, Clark was a racing driver who fought off so much talent from IndyCar drivers who were seasoned veterans. To go ahead and win that event was mesmerising. And it was all over the British news. Clark won the event. Oh my God, it was celebrations galore in England and in the UK to see Clark actually win the Indianapolis 500. It was huge. And I'm sure many people would have agreed with me on that particular point. Now, obviously, a few years prior to the Indianapolis 500 in 1962, Clark was actually involved in a horrendous crash at Monza, which sadly, if you might not have known that crash, killed Wolfgang von Trips, who used to be a Formula One driver. Of course, it happened down into the Parabolica, where von Trips went over the top of Clark, over the back of Clark's Lotus, and sadly into the crowd. And sadly, quite a few spectators that day died in 1962 at the Italian Grand Prix. And I remember that crash so much. It was one of the scariest accidents in motorsport history. And Clark was very lucky to survive that and come out and win the Indianapolis 500 3 years later. Was huge for many people. So, yes, and that year as well, Clark also took home the British Saloon Car Championship title as well. He also competed in a Ford Lotus Cortina in the British Saloon Car Championship, and he was a great driver in that series. He raced at Brands Hatch, I think Alton Park they went to as well. Quite a few racing drivers as well. It was huge. I mean, just looking at that, racing drivers have to be very, very alert when they're driving. They have to pinpoint exactly where everything goes, and it's a huge event to think. A huge event, this one. Motorsport is dangerous. Racing drivers put themselves on the line every day. But back in 1960s, it was very dangerous. And I know a lot of people out there would be very, very conscious of actually taking this sport up. It is a sport that is not for the faint of heart. If you do it, you are putting yourself at risk, because it is motorsport is very dangerous. But I can tell you guys that I absolutely love motorsport, and I do think in the future, if I took it up, I think certainly following the footsteps of Jim Clark would be very important indeed. So that was Clark's Indianapolis 500 championship winning there. But we're now going to get on to the bit that I think a lot of people are very much interested in. And that is what happened to Jim Clark after 1965. Well, the last couple of seasons for Clark in Formula One were very difficult for him. He did not win the championship, sadly, in the last couple of seasons. He struggled a lot in his last couple of years as drivers like Sir Jackie Stewart bursted onto the scene. 1968, though, Clark did start the season strongly that year as well. South African Grand Prix was his last Formula One entry. And it was race 1 of 12 in that actually season. And Jim Clark did actually win the South African Grand Prix in 1968. And he started off his season very strongly that year. And everybody thought Jim Clark was going to be a world champion once again. This man from Scotland could become a 3-time world champion in Formula One with Lotus. An unbelievable feat with Colin Chapman and him together. One of the greatest partnerships of Formula One history with him and Colin Chapman. This would be a huge, momentous partnership that would span the sport for the 1960s and for the decade. It was huge. However, though, things were about to take a turn for the worse for Clark. Sadly, in 1968, Jim Clark sadly passed away at a very young age. And unfortunately, in 1968, Jim Clark died at the tender age of just 32 after crashing out in the rain at Hockenheim in 1968 on the 7th of April. And this event was a Formula 2 race. Jim Clark had the option of doing a Formula 1 meeting at Brands Hatch, which would have been a meeting, I think it was the British or European Grand Prix, one of those two was at Brands Hatch, and also a German Formula 2 race. And Clark faithfully chose the Formula 2 race at Hockenheim on a very dangerous circuit, very treacherous conditions, and very cold temperatures. The race was seen by many as impossible to complete, and it was really difficult for the rear tyres. And Clark complained a lot that weekend of his car being very unstable. His Lotus that weekend was very unstable in his 38, and it was something that a lot of people didn't think Clark chose. Clark faithfully chose the F2 race. However, about 30 minutes in, disaster struck as Clark veered off into the forest at around 150 miles per hour and hit a tree, which sadly dented his car in half. And sadly, upon the impact of the crash, Clark sustained serious injuries, and sadly, he wasn't found. After a further excavation through the forest to retrieve the debris from that wrecked Lotus 38, Clark was not there. And sadly, he passed away after the crash. And to all you guys out there who knew Jim Clark, this man was an incredible talent to motorsport. A man who will be sorely missed by the motorsport world. And 1968 was a year that saw many people in deep shock. 1968 was a year that a lot of people grieved the loss of a legend in the sport. A year in which history would be made for Formula One. And of course, many people knew that the 1968 season in Formula One would be very sour indeed, losing Jim Clark. And of course, the world champion that year was a very important one. So the 1968 Formula One world champion that year, well, was Graham Hill, who actually won that year's title. And I think that was Graham Hill's second title, though, I believe to be correct. And wow, I mean, Graham Hill actually went and searched for Clark after he went actually looked through the wreckage of his car in the forest, and he couldn't find him. Graham Hill was looking through the wreckage, and sadly Clark wasn't there, and he was in absolute shock. He was absolutely shocked and stunned that Clark had lost his life. It was a very sorrowful moment in motorsport history. I could not believe it, and he certainly couldn't believe it as well, couldn't Graham Hill. So it was certainly an emotional win for Graham Hill that year in the 1968 Formula One World Championship. And yeah, Clark sadly died that day, and tributes poured over. And then in 2018, we celebrated a huge 50 years since the death of Jim Clark. And I am sure many people now watching this podcast today on the Hotlap Vodcast will know exactly right now that that day has very much passed in very sorrowful numbers. Indeed, over 63 years ago since Jim Clark lost his life in the crash at the Hockenheim ring. I mean, I could honestly think that Hockenheim had to have massive updates to its circuit after Clark's death. Chicanes were added to slow the cars down. There was even a chicane that was named after him. And the first chicane on the circuit was actually named after the two-time F1 world champion from Scotland. It was a very fitting tribute to all the motor racing. And back then, motor racing was dangerous. The cars were nowhere near as safe as they were now. And Jim Clark back then drove the cars to within the absolute limits that they could be reached. And I honestly think Clark right now is a driver who will be recognised by the many. Thank you so much for watching. Take care. And we'll see you next time for another edition of the Hotlap Vodcast. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. Take care and goodbye.